Porky's is one of those films that illustrates the rule, you'll never go broke underestimating the taste of the American public.
Remember when a low-budget R-rated movie about a bunch of Florida teenagers stumbled into theaters and accidentally outgrossed half of Hollywood's 1982 prestige lineup? Well, in 1981, 20th Century Fox picked up the distribution rights to Porkys, a scrappy Canadian finance comedy directed by Bob Clark, starring Dan Monahan, Kim Cattrall, Wyatt Knight, Khaki Hunter, and Nancy Parsons. Nobody at the studio expected much. Instead, they got one of the most controversial and financially unstoppable comedies of the decade. A movie about peepholes and panty raids that outraged critics, triggered lawsuits, and accidentally laid down the blueprint that every raunchy teen comedy has been chasing ever since. Today, we're going to count down 15 weird facts about Porkys. And stick around for number 2 because it connects Bob Clark to one of the most beloved Christmas movies ever made. Hit that like button and subscribe. All right, let's head back to Angel Beach. Number 15, the movie that beat Star Wars at its own game. In the spring of 1982, a comedy about hormone-fueled Florida teenagers walked into the American box office, sat down, and just refused to move.
You see, Porky's is the idiotic high school sex comedy that has been a box office smash.
Porky's held the number 1 spot for 8 consecutive weeks. 8 weeks. The Force Awakens held the top spot for 3 weeks. Avatar, the biggest movie of all time, topped out at 7. Porky's beat them both. A teen comedy about panty raids and peepholes outlasted a galaxy far, far away. This wasn't some studio behemoth. The whole thing was made for just a few $1,000,000 and pulled in over $100 million in North America alone. But here's the plot twist. This sweaty, all-American slice of teenage chaos, technically, it's Canadian. Every major Hollywood studio passed on the script. So Bob Clark took it north, tapped into Canadian tax shelter financing, and made the movie on his own terms. For more than 20 years, it held the title of highest-grossing Canadian film in history. In 1982, that was not a soft year. It was the summer of E.T., Rocky III, and Star Trek II. Porky still finished as one of the 5 biggest films of the year. Number 14, the script that Hollywood rejected that made millions anyway. The most commercially successful teen comedy of the early 80s wasn't born in a Hollywood writer's room. It was dictated into a cassette recorder by a guy stuck in bed with mononucleosis. Bob Clark was flat on his back, miserable, and probably contagious when he talked the entire story into a tape recorder over 4 days. His collaborator, Roger Swaybill, later said that the tapes were so funny he was weeping with laughter the first time that he listened. Hollywood wasn't. Clark took the finished script to every major studio in town. Every single one said no. The problem? Too raunchy, set in high school, too risky. So Clark went hunting for money in the strangest place imaginable and found it in shopping mall mogul Melvin Simon, whose day job was building the malls that those same teenagers were about to buy tickets in. Think about that. The financier who was bankrolling the most notorious teen comedy of the decade also owned the food courts that those same teenagers were hanging out in. The guy with mono had the last laugh, and Melvin Simon, he had the last Orange Julius. Number 13, the real Porkys had an even wilder story. Now, you'd assume a movie this outrageous had to be completely made up. Obviously fiction, right? Well, not exactly. And the real story was wilder than the movie. Porky's was inspired by an actual nightclub in Oakland Park, Florida, just outside of Fort Lauderdale. A full-blown cabaret open until 4 in the morning, with bikini contests, limbo competitions, and live acts. The man behind it was Donald Porky Baines, and he made the movie character look tame. Baines kept a pet lion in a cage behind the bar. He drove a pink Jeep, and he ran the hideaway flashy enough that the IRS eventually came knocking for unpaid cabaret excise taxes, which is exactly the kind of sentence that you can only write about one specific man in South Florida history. The tax case dragged on for years, and by the time the dust settled, the city had pulled his cabaret license. The mortgages had been foreclosed, and the IRS, they took everything. The bar shut down in 1967. A federal appeals court judge later described the whole collapse in exactly 3 words. Pursued by the furries. Pet lion, pink Jeep, federal tax case named after him. Bob Clark was soaking all of it up firsthand. He grew up in South Florida, running with a crew of high school friends who, by his own admission, were less than model citizens. He once described his teenage self as a savage little being, which, coming from the guy who later made Porky's, kind of tracks. Pee-wee, Meat, and Tommy weren't direct portraits of real friends. It was more like an amalgamation, built from Clark's actual crew. Number 12, the scene that almost got Porky's an X rating. You know which one I'm talking about. We're talking about that shower scene. The one that every guy in America claims he first saw at a friend's house when someone's older brother rented the VHS without asking. What you saw in theaters? That was the cleaned up version. When Bob Clark first submitted Porky's to the ratings board in 1981, that movie, it got slapped with an X rating. And in 1981, an X rating, that's a death sentence. No major theater chains, no newspaper ads. I mean, an X rating meant that your movie was over. So Clark pulled out the scissors. Multiple scenes had to be trimmed, but the most infamous cut happened during the peephole sequence, which in its original form actually went all the way. Co-star Mark Herrier later described the original version of the shot as the girls reacting to what looked like a snake coming out of the ground, when in reality, Herrier said the prop was an underwhelming fake that played deflating, not erotic. The ratings board was not persuaded. And then Coach Ballbricker enters the picture. Her attempt to identify the culprit leads to what might be the most deranged request ever delivered with a straight face in a principal's office, demanding a nude lineup of the suspect boys so she could spot the offending party by a distinctive mole. A demand that no HR department of any decade would approve, and yet that part, it stayed in the movie. Number 11, the phone prank that jumped from underground tapes to cinema. There's one scene in Porky's that every guy who saw it in 1982 immediately tried to pull off the next weekend. Pee-wee was in a phone booth, there was a diner full of unsuspecting customers, and a prank call asking if Mike Hunt was there. Yeah, you know the one. The waitress, Wendy, played by Khaki Hunter, pages the name over the parking lot loudspeaker, and one of the boys delivers one of the most quoted lines in the whole movie. Practically everybody in town from what I hear. Now here's what most people don't realize. That gag has a whole underground history that most people have forgotten. In the mid-70s, two guys from New Jersey named Jim Davidson and John Elmo started making prank calls to a dive called the Tube Bar in Jersey City, asking for customers with names like Mike Hunt, Alcoholic, and Ben Dover. They recorded the results, and those recordings got passed around on bootleg cassette tapes that lived in glove compartments and would get copied at parties until the audio just turned to mush. Porkys took the same gag name tradition that those tapes were built on and dropped it in front of tens of millions of moviegoers. A few years later, Sam Simon openly credited those exact Tube Bar tapes as the inspiration behind Bart's prank calls to Moe's Tavern in The Simpsons. Underground tapes, a blockbuster movie, and a primetime cartoon from prank calls. Insane. Number 10, when bad reviews became Porky's secret marketing weapon. In 1982, Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert were a final word on American movies. A positive review would get butts in seats. A negative one could sink a film overnight. And they gave Porky's a funeral.
But this film is excruciating to sit through because the jokes are so predictable, so drawn out, and in many cases so leering and offensive.
Both critics panned the movie on release and then piled on again at year-end when they named Porky's to their stinkers of 1982 list. Alongside gems like Inchin, Yes, Giorgio, and Grease 2, Siskel would later call it one of the worst films. Their issue wasn't the raunch, it was what they saw as a cruel streak. Female characters that were written as punchlines instead of actual people. Ebert even singled out the peephole scene and compared it to the famous ladder moment in Animal House, arguing that what played as ridiculous satire in one film came off as smarmy in the other, which for a teenage boy in 1982 was not the warning that critics thought it was. Smarmy, that wasn't a red light. It was a neon sign. Teenagers heard a respected grown-up call a movie smarmy and immediately wanted tickets for opening weekend. The backlash didn't kill interest, it actually manufactured it. Every disgusted column, every year-end worst of pile-on, all of it played like free advertising. Siskel and Ebert were among the most powerful critics in America, and without meaning to be, they were also some of the most effective marketing that Porky's ever got. Number 9, Kim Cattrall was terrified that this movie would end her career. Long before she became a household name, Kim Cattrall was a working actress with a classical background, American Academy of Dramatic Arts, stage work, a brief Universal contract, TV guest spots on Quincy, Columbo, and Starsky and Hutch. None of that paid like she needed it to. Then, Bob Clark came calling. Cattrall had already worked with him on Tribute in 1980, the Jack Lemmon drama that picked up an Oscar nomination. So when Clark pitched her on a raunchy little Florida comedy with a small role, she took the meeting. Her agents begged her not to do it. But Cattrall's reasoning was simple. Rent was due. She later openly called Porky's her rent money role, a job that kept her off the waitressing circuit and paid her bills for the next 6 months. But then, Porky's exploded. Cattrall has described being genuinely horrified when she realized how big the movie was going to be. Her name prominently on the poster, with people in the industry convinced that it was career suicide. And she said very openly that Porky's damaged her dramatic career. She argued that the typecasting cost her serious roles, parts she said outright suddenly Michelle Pfeiffer was getting instead. The real breakthrough that she wanted didn't arrive until 15 years later with Sex and the City. Sometimes the rent money role doesn't become the immediate launchpad. Number 8, the surprisingly serious subplot that nobody expected. Now, on the surface, Porky's is exactly what it sold itself as. Pranks, peepholes, panty raids, but there's a whole storyline running through the film that most people either forgot about or never noticed. The character of Brian Schwartz. Brian is the new kid at Angel Beach High. He's also Jewish, and a guy named Tim Cavanaugh spends the early scenes of the movie targeting Brian with bigotry that he's clearly inherited from his father. It's ugly, and it completely is at odds with the pranks that are happening in the rest of the film. That's the whole point. Bob Clark grew up in Alabama and then southern Florida, and he had direct memories of the casual bigotry of that era. Clark said that the Fort Lauderdale of his youth literally had "No Jews Allowed" signs on the beach. When he finally got to make Porky's, he refused to leave that memory out. The subplot pays off in one of the most unexpected moments of the entire movie. Tim's father, a violent, unrepentant bigot, shows up at the school, confronts Brian in front of everyone, and the confrontation chooses Tim to finally pick a side. He pushes Brian out of the way, stands up to his own father, and takes a beating for it, and then walks away from everything he was raised to believe. Clark puts it bluntly in a 2006 interview. Porky's was about anti-Semitism, about racism. It's not just about boys with erections. Turns out that the raunchy teen comedy actually did have a soul. Hey, quick pause. If you've been nodding along and remember the first time that you saw Porky's, hit that like button and drop a comment. Who was your favorite? Pee-wee, Meat, Tommy, or low-key Coach Brackett? All right, let's get back to Angel Beach High. Number 7, the 1954 time capsule that made Porky's hit different. Porky's released at a weird moment in film history. MTV just launched. The teen comedy with a pop soundtrack era was about to kick into gear. Fast Times was months away, and Flashdance a year out. Bob Clark looked at all of it and just shrugged. Porky's wasn't supposed to feel like 1982. It was supposed to feel like 1954, a lived-in, sweaty, small Florida version of it, with the actual music drifting out of car radios and diner jukeboxes at the time. Clark teamed up with his regular music collaborators, Paul Zaza and Carl Zitrer, and made a call that most directors wouldn't have had the guts to make. Zero contemporary music. Just Hank Williams, Patti Page, the Platters, the Crew Cuts. Now, while the characters were running around doing things that would have gotten them arrested in the actual 50s, the soundtrack underneath was sweet, wholesome, innocent. Patti Page singing Mockingbird Hill over scenes that absolutely nobody in 1954 would have approved of. The sweetness didn't soften the comedy either. It made it hit harder. Every prank felt weirder and more subversive precisely because it was scored like a Disney short. Porky's used music as a time machine. Number 6, the sequel that forgot to invite Porky. Now here's a trivia question that stumps almost everyone. In Porky's 2, The Next Day, a movie with the word Porky right there in the title, how many scenes does Porky himself actually appear in? 0. Not one. Not a cameo, not a flashback. The guy whose name is on the marquee simply isn't in the movie. Chuck Mitchell, the actor who made Porky one of the most memorable villains in early 80s comedy, flat out refused to come back. The sticking point was one very specific scene. In the original version of the climax, Porky was supposed to be among the unmasked members of a local hate group, stripped naked and paraded in front of the whole town. Full nudity in front of a crowd on camera. Mitchell said absolutely not. So Porky's 2 had to move forward without Porky, which is a problem when your entire franchise is named after him. So rather than scale back, the sequel floored it. The plot pivots to a small-town crusade. The Angel Beach kids are staging Romeo and Juliet, battling a sketchy local preacher and the town officials who want the play shut down. Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet in a Porky sequel. That's a real sentence. Now, when Porky's Revenge came around about 2 years later, it didn't require Mitchell to strip in front of a live crowd. So he showed up like nothing ever happened. Number 5, the movie got so big that it became an Atari game. In 1983, the home video game industry had one simple strategy when a movie hit big. Put it on a cartridge, ship it to Kmart, and figure out whether it was a good idea later. Which is how the world ended up with a Porky's video game for the Atari 2600. Now, released by 20th Century Fox Video Games, the tie-in compressed an R-rated teen comedy into a single 8-bit cartridge. Apparently on the logic that nothing says family toy aisle like an adaptation of a movie about high school boys committing felonies at a strip club. You played as Pee-wee Morris. The goal was to infiltrate Porky's bar and then blow the whole place up. Level 1 was basically Frogger. Pee-wee had to dodge across a 5-lane highway packed with cars, police, bouncers, and, this is not a joke, attack pigs. Yeah, actual pigs. And then, of course, you have the shower level. Yes, they adapted the shower scene for an Atari game. Pee-wee sneaks around a showering woman while avoiding Miss Ballbricker herself, rendered in crude bloxy pixels, somehow still recognizable as the terror of Angel Beach High. Running from an 8-bit Ballbricker in 1983, that had to have felt deeply spiritually accurate to anyone who grew up afraid of their gym teacher. Less a video game and more like a glitchy throwback. Number 4, Howard Stern's Porky's remake that never happened. In 2002, Howard Stern was arguably the most powerful voice in American radio, the king of all media. If Stern announced that he was doing something, it was going to happen. So when Stern announced that he'd locked down the remake rights to Porkys, nobody doubted it. There was only one problem. Stern wasn't the only one who thought he owned Porkys. Turns out that the rights had been carved up, sold off, or relicensed so many times that by the time Stern showed up, 3 different companies all believed that they controlled the franchise. So 3 sets of lawyers and 3 theories of who actually owned Angel Beach. One of those companies, facing a looming deadline to prove that they still held their rights, rushed a barely budgeted sequel into production just to check a box on paperwork. It surfaced in 2009 as Porky's Pimpin' Pee-wee. A movie that almost nobody saw, made almost entirely just to protect a legal claim. The whole mess eventually landed in court. It got quietly settled in 2013, and Stern's path to the remake was finally clear, and then the remake just never happened. The king of all media had the rights, he had the lawyers, and he had the settlement, but somehow he couldn't get Porky's back on the screen. Number 3, the cast had way more talent than anyone expected. Now, one could make certain assumptions about the cast, young unknowns that were plucked out of the community theater. Not quite. The Angel Beach High Class of '54 was quietly one of the most formally trained ensembles ever assembled for a movie about teenagers sneaking into strip clubs. Start with Pee Wee Morris. That was Dan Monahan, who, before anyone asked him to sprint across a field in his underwear, trained at Ohio University and performed in a Broadway production of Richard III starring Al Pacino. The guy playing Pee-wee had done the Bard next to Michael Corleone. Now, Coach Brackett, played by Boyd Gaines, is mostly remembered for awkward gym teacher energy. But in real life, Gaines is a Juilliard graduate and a 4-time Tony Award winner. Only one of 5 performers in Broadway history ever nominated in all 4 acting categories. Nancy Parsons, the woman who could silence a scene with one glare as ball-bricker, was trained at the Pasadena Playhouse. After Porky, she appeared in Steel Magnolias, shared scenes with Clint Eastwood in Sudden Impact, and then turned up in Star Trek: The Next Generation. Meet Tuparello was played by Tony Ganios, who'd broken out in The Wanderers. After Porky's, he landed a role in Die Hard 2, dying in one of the most painful-to-watch ways ever put in an action movie, courtesy of a well-placed icicle. And Khaki Hunter, who played Wendy, came loaded with international hardware. Best Young Actress in Germany, Best Actress at the San Sebastian Film Festival, and then in the early 90s, she quit the industry and became a whitewater rafting instructor in Utah. Yeah. Number 2, the guy who made Porky's also made A Christmas Story. Now, this is one of those facts that when you hear it for the first time, you assume someone's messing with you. The same director that gave us Porky's, the movie about teenage boys committing felonies in a Florida strip club, that's the exact same man who gave us A Christmas Story. Yeah. Ralphie, the leg lamp, the BB gun, the triple dog dare, one of my favorites. Same guy, same career. Clark had been trying to make A Christmas Story since 1968. He had first heard Gene Shepard's stories on the radio while driving to pick up a date in Miami.
Here to talk to you about the movie A Christmas Story, written by Mr. Gene Shepard.
And he got so absorbed that he made the date wait while he circled the block and spent the next 15 years pitching the project. Every studio said the same thing. No, it's too small, too quiet, too sentimental. But then Porky's exploded, and suddenly Bob Clark had leverage. A Christmas Story got greenlit on a tight $3.3 million budget. Clark waived his director's fee and put $150,000 of his own money into the production. And here's the part that really turns Clark's career into a curiosity. He also directed Black Christmas in 1974, one of the earliest films credited with inventing the modern slasher movie, plus Murder by Decree in 1979, a prestige Sherlock Holmes drama, as well as Tribute in 1980. Bob Clark, he had no lane. He just had the whole highway. Number 1, the ending that Bob Clark never got to make. Now, here's the thing about Bob Clark that almost nobody knows. The man who made Porky's, the movie that every studio rejected, that made over $100 million, yeah, he never stopped thinking about Angel Beach. He directed Porky's 2 himself, and then he walked away. He refused to touch Porky's Revenge. He reportedly hated the script. For 20 years, the franchise moved on without him. Other directors, other sequels, other cash grabs. Then, in the early 2000s, something shifted. Suddenly, the man who'd walked away from Angel Beach was working his way back. Clark was giving interviews, he was looking back and talking about the film with a warmth that he hadn't shown in years.
And they're redoing Porky's with Howard Stern. Now, I like Howard Stern.
A director in his late 60s revisiting the movie that had made his entire career possible. Then, on April 4th of 2007, Bob Clark was driving on the Pacific Coast Highway in Los Angeles when a drunk driver hit him head on. Clark was killed. His 22-year-old son, Ariel, was killed with him.
Tonight, movie director Bob Clark has been killed by a drunk driver.
Clark was 67. everything that he was building at the end, the remake, the renewed interest, the chance to go back to Angel Beach one more time, well, all of it ended that morning. The man who couldn't get Porky's made in 1980 also couldn't get his proper return to it made in 2007. Hollywood didn't stop him this time. A drunk driver did. And somehow, that might be the saddest thing about the entire Porky saga. So, there you have it, everybody. 15 weird facts about the movie that Hollywood didn't want, critics tried to bury, and audiences turned into a phenomenon anyway. Which fact caught you off guard? We'll drop it in the comments and tell us. Were you more Team Pee-wee, Team Meat, or Team I never admit to my parents that I saw this? Hopefully my mom doesn't watch this. Anyways, like, subscribe, and share this with whoever you stuck into Porky's with back in the day. And until next time, this is Remember When.